My name is Joey von Nessen. I am a research economist with the University of South Carolina. And I always like to say that our work involves what I call so what economics. And some of you have heard me use that term before, and I always use it half jokingly, but to make the point that we're always looking at economic data and asking the question, so what? How can we use economic data to help businesses and organizations make good strategic decisions? And so the first step in that process of making a good strategic decision is to understand the market landscape that you find yourself in and just what the economic environment looks like. And so that's what we're going to be talking about very briefly this afternoon. Where are we in October of 2024? What are our expectations going forward for the fourth quarter and into 2025? And we'll look back a bit as well to give us some context for where the economy is likely headed over the next several months and into 2025. So starting out then, I think it's important to really set the stage for where we are by assigning the economy a grade. We can just take a quick snapshot and say, how is South Carolina's economy doing? How is the U.S. economy doing overall, if we look across all metrics? And I would suggest to you that we can grade the economy today as a B+. A B+, if we had to assign it one grade. Now, why a B+? Because if we look at most economic metrics, they are continuing to perform fairly well. Consumer spending has been very steady throughout 2024. We've seen a very strong labor market and very positive wage growth as well, strong wage growth overall. So by most measures, the economy continues to do very well as we move into the fourth quarter. But we don't get an A performance. Why? For two reasons. Number one, we're seeing that loss in purchasing power that is still permeating most South Carolinians and across most of the U.S. If we look at wage growth and we look at how prices have been rising, overall consumers have lost purchasing power over the last 3 to 4 years, and that is creating a financial strain on many consumers that's in fact impacting their purchase behavior in certain sectors. And secondly, we've also been seeing a slowdown in the economy throughout 2024. So despite the fact that the economy today, as a snapshot in October, is performing well, it's been slowly losing momentum throughout 2024. So a couple of weak spots in an otherwise bright economy that has been doing well overall. So again, a B+ is our overall ranking. Now, how can we see this loss in momentum that has started to emerge in 2024? Well, it turns out this is very easy to see because we can look at changes in both the South Carolina and U.S. unemployment rates, and you can see a steady uptick throughout 2024, particularly in South Carolina, where the unemployment rate has jumped from 3% to 4.3%, more than a percentage point, just since January. So a pretty significant change there. And of course, at the U.S. level, we haven't seen quite as much of a change, but still a steady uptick in the unemployment rate overall. And that begs the question of whether a recession is right around the corner. We've seen more concern about a recession this year emerge, particularly since the summer months, and this is a major reason why, an uptick in unemployment and a slowdown in the labor market as a whole. But the good news here is that when we look at these data, we have to put this in context, and I'll give you a kind of a giveaway for later, which is not to panic, that the economy does remain on solid ground. And I want to share with you the data that really persuade us of that despite the fact that we've seen a slowdown in the labor market overall, we are cautiously optimistic as we move forward into the fourth quarter. So to do that, before we look forward, let's briefly look backwards and look at how we got to where we are in October of 2024 to set the stage for looking ahead. And the way to do that is to look at the new economic paradigm that has emerged in the last several years. And I like to call this new economic paradigm the Great Readjustment. And some of you have heard me use this term before, and I've used it multiple times because this is a multi-year readjustment that the South Carolina and U.S. economies are going through following the onset of the pandemic in 2020. The Great Readjustment. What are we readjusting to? We're readjusting to an equilibrium between supply and demand that has been very much out of balance over the last several years, where demand has far exceeded supply, something that we see every day, particularly that we saw during 2020 and 2021 with the supply chain constraints that we're all familiar with. But we also saw very high levels of demand that emerged in 2020 and in 2021 for two specific reasons. Number one, we had a rapid labor market recovery in which most people went back to work fairly quickly and started earning incomes that they were able to spend. And then secondly, we saw $6 trillion in stimulus in 2020 and in 2021 that took the form of stimulus checks, that took the form of enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, that took the form of a variety of tax credits. So in both cases, we see dollars that were provided directly to consumers, to American households, in terms of the stimulus dollars that were able to move directly to households, as well as, of course, labor income as people went back to work. And so you put that together, and consumers were in a very good financial position and were able to spend those dollars, and they did, and that led to very high levels of demand that we're still readjusting from. Now, this is very easy to see. I'll just briefly show you evidence for both of these elements in the data. We can look at employment growth overall in South Carolina, which you can see has been very steady following a rapid recovery in 2020 and in 2021. Also notice, this is not just a story of a recovery from the pandemic losses, but also a story of the fact that employment growth has been fairly stable ever since. And in fact, employment growth overall has been stronger since 2021 compared to the average rate of employment growth during the previous decade overall. And why is employment so important? Because it's the single best predictor that we have for housing demand. So it's important to keep our eye on what labor market trends look like. And again, in South Carolina overall, they continue to be strong going into 2024. And certainly, overall, over the last 3 years, we've seen a very healthy labor market as a whole. Now, we can also look at that $6 trillion in stimulus. I mentioned a rapid labor market recovery, but also we see those stimulus dollars that in many cases directly were able to directly go into the pockets of households, of consumers, and give them additional financial resources. And we can actually track that and see the effects of it very clearly if we look at what's been happening with disposable income levels. And once again, you can see a significant increase during 2020 and in 2021. A lot of these major jumps correspond to the stimulus checks themselves. But overall, you can see a sizable increase and then a pullback to pre-pandemic trend levels, right? So today, we see that disposable income levels are basically on par with where we would expect them to be if the pandemic had not occurred. So overall, consumers are still in a fairly good financial position, right? Not as good as they were last year this time, right? Because they've been drawing down many of these financial resources. They've been spending those dollars, particularly in order to preserve their spending activity in a period of high inflation, right? So they've needed additional dollars to preserve their levels of spending. But overall, disposable income levels, again, are on par with where we were before the pandemic. Because keep in mind, these are real dollars, real U.S. disposable income. What does real mean? It just means inflation adjusted. So consumers as a whole, again, on average, still in a fairly good financial position. And so this has led to fairly steady rates of consumer spending that, if anything, are slightly higher now than they were before the pandemic began. So you can see we're still fairly elevated compared to trends that we were experiencing before 2020. So consumer spending overall still in pretty good shape. And this is important to track as well because consumer spending represents about 70% of GDP. About 70% of our economy can be tracked back to consumer spending. So overall, again, things are looking pretty good and fairly steady. But we have to scratch beneath the surface to get a more nuanced view of what's going on. Because this is a bit, even though this is accurate at an aggregate view, at a high level, we need to look a bit beneath the hood to get a better sense of what sectors have been affected most and which ones have been seeing a lot of change over the last several years. And we can do that very easily by breaking down consumer spending into the goods market and into the services market, into the service sector. And here's where you see a real difference begin to emerge. So if we look over the last several years, what you'll notice here is a durable goods bubble that has emerged. And part of the great readjustment that we're going through right now, the multi-year great readjustment period, is a period where we're seeing a durable goods bubble that formed, and we're readjusting back to pre-pandemic norms in terms of spending for the average consumer. So in 2020 and in 2021, when consumers had access to all of these additional financial resources, they were spending, but they were spending it in the goods sector, right? Because we were all staying home. We were socially distanced. We weren't going out to eat. We certainly weren't getting on an airplane, right? We were staying home and spending these dollars either moving or renovating or buying furniture or purchasing any number of manufactured items, but we certainly weren't spending it on the services sector, right? So this peaks in 2021, and then we begin to see the pendulum shift back in the other direction, back towards the services sector. And in 2024, for the first time, we've seen the goods bubble basically fully deflate. And in South Carolina, why does that matter? Because durable goods translates into changes in housing and in manufacturing. And we're going to talk about both of those here momentarily, but basically what you're going to see is that the trends in manufacturing and housing reflect what we're seeing in the broader goods sector. So in a sense, we've seen a mini bubble in housing and a mini bubble in many respects in manufacturing as well. But in 2024, that bubble has deflated. And so that has implications for stability and potential growth as we look forward for the rest of this year and into 2025. So we want to keep this at the forefront of our thoughts as we're going through and looking at trends as we move forward. So that's the good news. A resilient economy, steady consumer spending that we have seen, albeit very differently depending on if you're in the goods industry or if you're in the services sector. Household financial resources, still very stable, and as we've seen, a very healthy labor market with consistent employment gains over the last several years. Now, what about the bad news? I want to come back and talk briefly about what this means that we've seen high inflation and high levels of, or rather high interest rates over the last several years to combat this high inflation. And this has really taken its toll on purchasing power, as we talked about before. Again, as everyone in this room is very much aware of, we see prices going up. And inflation is one metric that doesn't spare anyone, right? Everyone is facing prices on a regular basis, and we see these prices rising. And so every consumer, every American is very familiar with changes in inflation and changes in the underlying price level. So we can actually track this over time and just get a simple snapshot of what these differences look like. Just how much has inflation been going up, and how does that track to overall wage levels? And if we compare directly, we can look and just compare 2021 to 2024. So these are the most recent data that we have on both wage growth and inflation. And this looks at the last 3 years overall. Okay, so we're comparing 2021 to 2024. The bottom two bars here show average hourly earnings, again, over a 3-year period. And we can compare that to the inflation rate. Right, so very clear. You can see the loss in purchasing power that most Americans have experienced. And even more so when we compare wage growth to changes in food and energy prices, which are basically the two types of prices that most consumers are seeing on a day-to-day basis, the ones that we're faced with regularly. So a clear difference between wage growth and inflation in terms of food prices. Energy prices have actually come down recently. In 2024, so if you've been tracking prices at the pump, for example. So overall, we've seen energy prices rising at about the same rate that wages have been. If we looked at this 6 or 12 months ago, that top bar for energy prices would have been much higher. So we've actually seen some declines there. But overall, these, again, are the two major categories that most consumers are facing every day. Now, the other factor when we look at these changes in price levels is that we have hit an inflection point in the last year. What do we mean by that? Inflation has been coming down steadily, and within the last year, for the first time, we've actually seen wage growth begin to outpace the rate of inflation. And so if we look at the same picture, but look at it between 2023 and 2024, so just the last 12 months, compared to the last 3 years, you get a very different picture of what's going on, which you can see here. Inflation, currently at 2.5%. If we look at average hourly earnings, 3.9%, actually up to 4%. We just got September data released for wage growth. So wages are growing much faster than prices, but that actually makes the previous slide even more important to consider, because when we look over the last 3 years, that actually takes this into account, right? Does that make sense? So even though we've seen wages growing faster than prices, it's not enough to undo all the losses that consumers have experienced over the last 3 years. So consumers are clawing back some of that lost purchasing power, but are still down in the aggregate over the last 3 years. Does that make sense as to why that's the case? So that helps explain why, despite the fact that inflation has dropped and is now back down to 2.5%, we still get pictures like this, where consumer confidence remains low, certainly by pre-pandemic standards, even though, as we said, the economy is doing pretty well overall, a B+ rating, and inflation has come down to 2.5%. Why is it the case that consumer sentiment is low? Because most consumers have still lost purchasing power, and getting back to that durable goods bubble, if you are in housing, if you're in manufacturing, or any sector that touches that broader goods market, then you've been going through some level of correction over the past year or two. So the goods market is not necessarily feeling as good about the economy right now as the services sector, which by many measures it's having some of its best years ever. Tourism in South Carolina, for example, has been doing very, very well in 2024. So it really depends on the sector that we're looking at. Now, if we look at the business side, we looked at the consumer side when looking at high interest rates and the effects of inflation. Let's also talk a little bit more about what's going on the business side. And again, getting back to this durable goods bubble. And we've seen housing and manufacturing experience a significant pullback, particularly housing, because housing has been on the front lines in this battle against inflation, because housing is the most expensive item that consumers typically buy. So when interest rates rise in an effort to combat inflation, the housing market is the first one affected, and it's typically the hardest hit. But again, the good news here is that durable goods bubble has now deflated, and we're seeing more stability. That's true in manufacturing, and it's especially true in housing. And that makes us more optimistic about going forward with respect to potential growth looking ahead to 2025. So let me just briefly show you some evidence for this. If we look at the data first on housing sales in South Carolina, so these are annual growth rates that track back to 2017. And you can very easily see the durable goods bubble, I would argue, right? Because this is just the housing component of it. So you see the uptick in sales activity in 2020 and in 2021, followed by a pullback. So the horizontal black line there is 0%. So that's positive, the marker between positive and negative growth. And you can see a pretty strong correlation there, right? When interest rates started to rise, the first rate hike was in March of 2022, and we begin to see growth move in a negative direction, which persists for close to 2 years. But in 2024, particularly in recent months, you can see that growth has basically mitigated and approached zero, and in some months has actually been positive. So what does that tell us? It tells us that correction, that market correction that we are seeing, is largely behind us, which means that we're more likely to see stability as we move forward into the fourth quarter and into 2025. We can also compare what's been going on with prices compared to sales activity. So that looked at annual growth. This looks at cumulative growth going back to 2017, just year over year. And you can see overall sales levels in South Carolina roughly comparable to where we were back in 2017. again, maybe slightly down, depends on the month of comparison, so this varies quite a bit. But the bottom line is that, once again, you can see that we have readjusted, because in a sense we were borrowing future demand and now we're readjusting to pre-pandemic levels of sales activity. Growth was significantly negative for a period of time, now approaching zero, right? So we're seeing that deflated bubble, which is good news for future stability and growth. Notice also, if we compare to what's been going on with prices, as you all know, prices are continuing to rise, significantly so. And even though they've tapered somewhat, right, prices aren't rising quite as quickly as they were. That horizontal line, the blue horizontal line, isn't nearly as steep as it was before 2022, but it's still positive, right? We're still seeing significant growth in terms of pricing. And this comes down to the inventory challenge that South Carolina and the U.S. still faces, both from a long run and a short run perspective. We're facing a decade-long period of underbuilding in South Carolina and in the U.S. coming out of the Great Recession, where because many builders went bankrupt, others were very skittish about getting back into the market. Others were worried about new regulations that were introduced in the aftermath of 2008. We've seen a decade-long period of underbuilding at the same time that population growth in South Carolina has been accelerating. And many of you may not have seen the latest statistics on population growth in the state, but South Carolina was actually ranked #1 in the last year in terms of its overall growth rate in population. We've been consistently in the top 5, and we were #1 over the last 12 months. So this is an acceleration of a trend that has been emerging over the previous decade. So a major imbalance between supply and demand as demand continues to grow because of strengthening population gains, strengthening population growth overall. Then we can also look at this from a short-run perspective. So that's the long-run changes that we've been seeing in terms of this imbalance between supply and demand. But in the short run, we've seen that trend exacerbated because of these interest rate hikes, right? So we hear a lot about the lock-in rate, right? The idea that interest rates have been high. So if you are an existing homeowner and you're locked into a 2 or 3% mortgage interest rate, now a 6 or 7% rate doesn't look so attractive. So that's been exacerbating this inventory challenge over the past 2 years, and is one reason why, as we see rates begin to come down, as the Fed has started to lower rates in September, that could ease some of these inventory challenges, again, from existing homeowners that are going to be more likely to sell in a way that they weren't just a year or two ago. That's not going to combat the long-term inventory challenge, but it can make a difference on the margin. You can see the impacts here already of mortgage interest rates having dropped in the last several months. And you can just compare that to the average existing U.S. mortgage rate of 4.1%. Just to give some perspective on where that difference is and how it's been starting to come down, even though there still is a meaningful gap there between roughly 6% where mortgage interest rates are today and the average household that currently maintains a mortgage, which across the U.S. is on average about 4.1%. Right? So as we begin to see rates come down, that should help with that lock-in effect, and once again, help to contribute to the stability that we're seeing in the market and potentially have a positive impact on demand as we move forward. And then one other element I'll share with you, one other factor with respect to these inventory challenges where you can really see this, is if we look at construction employment growth in South Carolina. Right? So unlike what we saw with sales activity, when rates went up, what happened to employment growth in construction? Well, I can barely tell, if you look at that line, I can barely tell where 2022 is, right? We're March of 22. No real change at all. Why is that the case? How is that possible? Well, it's only possible because of a lack of inventory. So builders are continuing to stay busy, again, depending on the market, but overall around the state, despite the fact that sales activity has come down. So the wild card there, the explanatory factor there that resolves that apparent contradiction is this ongoing lack of inventory that remains a challenge in South Carolina. All right, so just briefly then, I want to share with you what's going on in manufacturing, just to illustrate we're seeing the same point. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, but this is the ISM Purchasing Managers Index, which is basically just a broad measure of manufacturing. And I just want to illustrate that you see the same basic trend, right? You see the same durable goods bubble in the manufacturing sector as you did in housing. So the durable goods industry overall has seen this correction, but it's now largely stabilizing. Once again, that's good news as we look forward. So more generally, what can we say then about 2025? So that looks backwards. We can see that we're continuing to experience a strong economy, which we'll call a B+. Most metrics are positive, except for purchasing power that has been eroded. As a snapshot, we're doing well, but we're losing momentum in the labor market, which we have seen. And it highly depends on whether you're in the goods market or the services sector as to how you're perceiving the economy right now. It's very bifurcated, right? The more you're tied to the goods market, you're not necessarily going to be as optimistic or seeing as much positivity as you are if you're in the services sector. So what does that tell us about 2025? What can we say about the rest of this quarter and then looking ahead? 2 key points here that we'll talk about in a bit more detail. Number one, we are at lower risk for a recession today than we were earlier this year and that we were back in 2023. So we're more optimistic that we will not see a recession in the short run, looking ahead. But the bad news is that we are now at higher risk for inflation rebounding. Okay, so two major takeaways in terms of where we are right now. So I want to briefly go through each one. Okay, so we are more optimistic that we avoid recession, but we are more at risk for inflation rebounding. So, lower recession. Let's talk about that specifically. First, let's talk about why did we see this fear of recession really rise again in 2024? What's been happening? And specifically, why did this just happen this summer? Because unemployment, if you go back and look at the labor market and the unemployment rate, it's been steadily ticking upwards all year long. It's not unique to this summer. So what happened this summer to where basically everybody freaked out? Well, we had two pieces of information that came out back to back. First, on July 31st, which seems like an eternity ago now, doesn't it? July 31st, that was the last time the Fed announced that they were not going to lower interest rates. So if you remember, they came out and said, Jay Powell came out, did a press conference, said they were getting closer to lowering rates, but the data didn't yet warrant it, right? They're tracking these inflation data as inflation comes down. So you say, okay, well, that's the decision they make. 2 days later, 48 hours later, August 2nd, we get an unemployment report. Worst unemployment rate in the US since October of 2021. And so what happens? Investors panic. They say, the Fed waited too long to act. We're going to go into a recession. And if you track the stock market, what you'll find is that there's been a lot more volatility since August 1st compared to what we were seeing before August 1st in 2024. And a lot of that comes down to this question, a lot of concern that the Fed waited too long to act. So the question is did they? Was this September rate cut, was it too little too late? And the short answer is no, probably not. It looks like the labor market is softening, but the Fed is acting in accordance with the data that are accurate, that we're seeing. And so we can take a bit more of a detailed look at what the Fed is doing by re-examining their dual mandate, so to really get a sense of what the Fed has been doing and why they waited as long as they did. Remember that the mandate of the Fed, they have two goals, just two. They want to maintain price stability, they want to keep inflation low, and they want to maximize employment. Okay, so two goals, which unfortunately require them to move interest rates in the opposite direction. Right? So they want to raise interest rates when inflation is too high, and they want to bring inflation down. They want to lower rates when they need to stimulate the economy to improve the labor market. And so what we've been seeing is a focus almost exclusively on goal number one over the last 2 years, getting inflation down. And they've been largely successful with this. As you can see, inflation has come down. We talked about current levels of inflation at about 2.5%. So significant progress here. And what we've seen since the summer, which you don't hear as much about, is the fact that inflation is coming down in both the goods sector and in the services sector. And this is why the Fed was more confident and more comfortable lowering rates in September than they were this past summer. Because you'll notice that inflation has been fairly flat, right? It dropped down to about 3% and has been bouncing around between 2.5% to 3.5% over the last year. So is it going to really equalize there, stabilize, or is it going to continue to go down? Well, this summer, for the first time, this just looks at same data, overall inflation, broken down into the goods and the services sector. And I've highlighted there, I've circled, where you can see inflation in the service sector get down to the Fed's goal of around 2% for the first time in 3 years. So that gave the Fed that extra confidence, right? The goods market's doing okay, but the service sector has seen elevated inflation that's been consistent. And we see a change for the first time this summer. And so that gives the Fed that extra confidence that, okay, inflation is continuing to come down. We're more optimistic we get to 2%. So now we can focus on the labor market. Because when you raise interest rates, you're kind of dealing with the primary symptom here of high inflation. But now we're to the point we can kind of deal with some of these secondary side effects, right? So you can think about the economy as a medical patient, right? And so when you raise interest rates, you're going to get side effects, slower growth, increases in unemployment, which is exactly what we've seen over the past 2 years. And we can see that especially in South Carolina. If we look at employment growth, positive employment growth throughout, going all the way back to 2021, right? Steady positive employment growth, but not as strong since the Fed started raising rates. About 3% employment growth currently compared to closer to 4% for what we saw in 2021 and 2022. Again, a very strong labor market where we are today, but not as strong as it was a couple of years ago. As the Fed chair, Jay Powell, has said consistently, we've gone from an excessively tight labor market to a tight labor market. So it's important to recognize that a slowing economy doesn't mean that we're going into recession or even that we're in a bad position from a labor market perspective. So very positive growth, but not as high as it was a year or two ago. We can also look at other measures where you can see this slowing of the labor market, these side effects kicking in. The job openings rate overall for the US, you can see peaked in 2021, and it's been steadily coming down, now approaching pre-pandemic norms, again, as part of this broader readjustment, this great readjustment that we've seen over the last several years. And then finally, we can look at initial unemployment insurance claims, which is a very important leading metric because it gives us some insight into the number of newly laid off people in South Carolina. So when you are laid off from your job as a South Carolinian, you have the option to go file for unemployment insurance at the South Carolina Department of Employment and Workforce. And the first time you file for unemployment insurance benefits, you're considered an initial claimant. And so we can track the number of initial claimants over time that gives us perspective on any layoff activity that's happening in South Carolina, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. And again, the bottom line here is that we see levels of initial unemployment insurance claims that are right on par with pre-pandemic norms. So no real evidence that we're seeing any type of significant uptick in layoff activity. So again, a healthy labor market overall. And the bottom line here then is that unemployment is rising due to slower job growth, not due to increased layoff activity. So there's never really a good reason for the unemployment rate to go up. We don't ever want to see that. But if there were a good reason, it would be for the reasons that it's going up in 2024. So a very important distinction when we're looking at the labor market. So good news overall on the labor market front. The one weak spot that we are seeing, however, when we look at consumers, is the delinquency rate among consumer loans. So if there is any yellow or red flag out there in terms of caution about a potential threat of a recession, this would be the one that I would urge you to focus on, and one that we are looking at. Just the delinquency rate itself of consumer loans, which you can see is now ticked up to about 2.7% or so. If this gets above 3%, that's where we begin to see some concerns with respect to banks beginning to take notice. So this is what I would call a yellow flag. I wouldn't say it's a red flag, but really the one metric that is somewhat concerning right now that we want to keep our eye on as we move forward. Okay, so that's why we see a lower risk for recession. Again, a labor market that is healthy, that remains healthy, and what the Fed is doing is trying to stay ahead of the curve and try to stabilize the market where we are. So it's not a reaction to a deteriorating economy. Now, what about inflation? Why is inflation likely to rebound as we move forward? Why are we more concerned about this? Bottom line, everybody is fighting the Fed all across the board. And it's not really a question of who's fighting the Fed, it's who's not fighting the Fed right now. A lot of different factors are contributing to high demand and factors that could potentially increase prices. Strong consumer spending that we've talked about already. That's a good thing from a demand perspective, but it also can contribute to keeping inflation at its current level or perhaps increasing it. But it's more of a combination. Consumer spending, when we add these other factors to it, we still have a labor shortage. We still have a historically low unemployment rate in South Carolina, despite the fact that it's seen a significant uptick. We're all aware of the strikes that have been emerging. The ILA, for example, we see Boeing is currently on strike. We've had several labor strikes in the last several years. And that's because a labor shortage has allowed more bargaining power for workers at an individual level and at a collective level when we're talking about strikes and the prevalence of strikes that we've seen increase in recent years. And we are seeing very high rates of wage growth as a result of this labor shortage, and we're seeing wage growth actually pick up again in the last several months. So again, good news for workers, but poses additional risks for inflation. We also see elevated shipping costs, which is the result of the Houthi attacks and a lot of what's been going on in the Middle East. Higher government spending. And as we look forward and talk a little bit about 2025, one of the things that we are seeing among both presidential candidates is that both are likely to continue to contribute to deficit spending in the new year. So high levels of spending with a lot of programs they want to enact. So again, that increases demand, increases the likelihood of higher inflation, and of course, overall geopolitical uncertainty, which can affect energy prices, among other things. So we do expect that inflation has a chance of going back up. We're not predicting that, but the risk is elevated. So what does this imply for housing demand for 2025? Well, it's actually pretty good news, because if we look at all the factors that have been changing in the last year, what we can see is more market stability going forward compared to what we've seen in the last 12 to 18 and certainly 24 months. Why? Because we've seen this deflated housing bubble, durable goods bubble, complete the process, right? We're back to pre-pandemic levels. Most of this readjustment is behind us, and that has occurred since essentially the spring of 2024. So you combine that, you combine the deflated bubble, the correction, which is largely behind us, with lower interest rates, as the Fed is looking to get ahead of a slowdown in the labor market, and then add on to that the fact that we're still seeing steady job growth, the number one predictor for housing demand. So you put all three together, and that leads us to the conclusion that we are likely to see more market stability and possibly positive growth as we move ahead into 2025. So a much more optimistic outlook for 2025 in terms of potential growth in sales activity, really for the first time in a significant period of time. Now, the other factor we can add to this, if we are likely to see more stability and possibly an uptick in demand over the next year, is housing policy that's coming out of Washington right now with the two presidential candidates. And there's a lot going on at a high level. Again, we don't have a lot of details to these policies yet, but I just want to offer one comment on this, which is that we can really break these policies down into two components or two buckets. And I would say there I'd say you can look at increasing supply on the one hand, and you can look at increasing demand on the other. Right? So two separate buckets that we can put these policies into. And so we have to think about what these short and long run implications are likely to be. So from a demand perspective, this is going to be positive for 2025, or has the potential to be. Again, because we see more market stability, we're seeing lower interest rates. And so if we do see policies enacted that boost demand, that can have, again, positive impacts for sales activity in 2025. But from a macroeconomic perspective, looking more broadly over the next several years and for the housing market specifically, these efforts to increase supply are going to be very important for affordability. So we have to think of demand, supporting demand in the short run versus supporting or improving affordability in the long run. And affordability, attainability is a challenge that we all that we hear about on a regular basis. And the major cause of the lack of affordability, rising prices, is that lack of supply, that lack of inventory. So it really depends on where the different policies fit. Which bucket are they going into? So we have to think about, are they going towards an effort to increase demand or to increase supply? Because those are going to have very different outcomes. And of course, as we're increasing demand, to a certain extent, that can counteract some of these efforts for affordability. Right? So it's important to understand which bucket these fall into and what the implications are going to be for the market, both in the short run and in the long run. So wrapping up, where are we in October of 2024? The bottom line, South Carolina's economy remains strong, remains in good shape. We've talked about a rating of B+. Again, as I've mentioned, most metrics show an economy in good shape in 2024 if we take a snapshot. But we have lost momentum in the jobs market. And the goal of the Fed in lowering rates is to keep our market where it is today. Right? So we've been traveling at 85, 90 miles an hour when the economic speed limit is 65. We've kind of hit the brakes and we're at 65 now. And so the goal isn't to speed us back up, it's just to preserve where we are. Right? We're going the speed limit, but we just don't want to slow down any further. So that's what the Fed is, what their goal is as we move forward. One of the major risk factors going forward, as I mentioned, that inflation could tick back up in 2025. We're not predicting that. And certainly we're not predicting that inflation would rise anywhere near to 9% like it was in 2024. When we say it may go back up next year, we mean it may go above 3%, so between 3 and 4%, if we see several of those factors we talked about come to fruition. So that's really the risk factor for 2025 at this point. And again, the Fed's goal here is to stabilize, not stimulate economic growth, because we are in a good position in terms of where we are. And so as a result, it's unlikely we'll see a significant acceleration of the state's economy this year, but we could see an improvement in housing demand in the coming months as we move forward. And I'll leave you with this percentage. The likelihood of recession in 2025 we expect is about 25%. So kind of easy to remember, 25 in 25, right? Which is actually fairly low. And the reason we use that number is to illustrate that the probability of recession is fairly low next year, but it's non-trivial, right? 25% is still a significant number. And that's because if we were to see a perfect storm where inflation begins to tick back up, such that the Fed cannot lower rates any further, and we continue to see a slowing economy, that could pave the way for what we call stagflation, right? High inflation and low growth, which could lead to a recession. I don't see that happening. That would be that would be a perfect storm scenario, but that's why we see the risk of inflation as low, but still not zero. It's still a non-trivial percentage, so about 25% in 2025. So I will stop there. Thank you all very much for your attention.